Okay, so let's step back a little. This is about the thing that I mentioned yesterday, that uh, I talked about two copies of angular momenta j and k, and I had actually said that one of them transforms like a pseudo vector and the other transforms like a vector, which is not quite true. In fact, that's what Aman was pointing out in the last lecture, that these commutational relations don't seem to satisfy that property, and that was quite correct. The thing is that in fact j and k do not have any specific transformation property under parity, but linear combinations of j and k do. Okay, so we continue to have same commutational relations, but under three-dimensional parity transformations they do not have any specific transformation property. Okay, so and and that is because they are the linear combination of those actually have it. So of course, if uh, if the two pieces have different transformation property, j or k wouldn't be transforming in a appropriate way under parity transformation. Okay, so that resolves this commutational relation issue because there is no clear parity transformation property between j's and k's. However, when you go down and write down new linear combinations, then these new linear combinations have have well-defined parity transformations. And what you find is that the MAs transform like components of pseudo vector, whereas NAs transform like components of vector. Okay, so in order to kind of uh, uh, I mean, in my notes, I had written M's and N's first and then related that to two copies of SU2. But to save time, I kind of continued using the two copies of algebra to arrive at SO4 instead of from SO4 going to SU2. That's why but kept the arguments the same. So in the process, it led to this confusion. But so now the statements are correct. And now you see that this transforms like a pseudo vector. That means under parity, this wouldn't change sign, whereas n would change sign. So now if you go down and look at the commutation relation, then you will see that first commutation relation, nothing changes sign anyway, so which is fine. In the second commutation relation, n would change sign, but then you have n on the right also. So left hand side would change sign and so would the right hand side. And the third commutation relation, left hand side will change sign twice, but that is like having no sign, and the right hand side doesn't change sign because that is a pseudo vector. Okay, so this is a commutation relation which has a proper transformation property under parity transformation, as against uh, the j and k commutation relation, and that is what Aman was asking last time, and I mean it stayed in my head, but like I realized it only after the lecture was over that I was talking about the wrong parities of the wrong set of generators. Okay, but nevertheless, what is important really is that these set of generators are useful for doing representation theory, and these set of generators, M's and N's, are useful for actually studying rotations in four-dimensional space, which are written down explicitly here. Okay, so if you want to do rotations in four-dimensional space, you would actually, four-dimensional Euclidean space, you would actually use these matrices as generators. Okay, but representation theory, you don't have to do it using these matrix representation of generators. You can choose any basis which is suitable for you, and that's why J and K basis is much more suitable, and in which the algebra decomposes into two uh, algebras which are direct sums of each other, and therefore you can do independent representation theory and just juxtapose them into ordered pair, something we have done. Okay, and so this kind of mistake on my part has no reflection on the Lorentz algebra side of the story, because on that side uh, we did not worry about these kind of transformation at all, and everything goes through as it is. Okay, so there's no problem there. Okay, there were a few typos which I have already corrected there. Okay, so this file, this part of the file is already updated in the Dropbox. Today's lecture, I have not had time. I just completed typing it, so I will kind of upload that at the end of this lecture. Okay, so any questions about this? So I hope at least it clarifies the point. I mean, I made a statement about J and K which was not correct. I should be making a statement about M and L. At least that point is clear.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So let's go down and we were supposed to study hydrogen atom problem. So we'll have to scroll down a bit because all this part is already done. We studied the Pauli equation last time, and we also saw that you kind of naturally get the gyromagnetic ratio for uh, this particle to be 2, which is kind of a natural explanation of what you find in the experimental experiments. Okay, so I would just run through this thing because we have already done this stuff up to Larmor precision. No precision, we had done this. So I suppose I can leave it up to this point, or should I just do a recap of that? This is not directly related to the discussion of hydrogen atom anyway, but if you want, I could do a recap of this.
Maybe yes, if everyone is fine with it,
Okay.
then you can.
Okay. Okay, then maybe we can just start with the hydrogen atom problem. So, so we want to solve the hydrogen atom problem using the Dirac equation now. Okay, so now we have already done this several times, once using Schrodinger equation, once using the Klein-Gordon equation, but let's try to do this again using uh, the Dirac equation. Okay, so in this case, the Coulomb potential, which is written as capital phi, is minus Z by R. Okay, and this is of course a potential which depends only on the radial, the magnitude of the vector, radial vector, and therefore the problem is of course a central potential problem. In other words, if you look at the symmetries of the problem, the thing that you find is that angular momentum would be a conserved quantity, because in central potential, that is one of the conserved quantities that you would find. Okay, so rotation is a symmetry and angular momentum is conserved. In addition, this potential of course does not involve time, and as a result time translation is a symmetry, and that would imply that the energy is conserved. Okay, and the third thing that you would find is a parity transformation which corresponds to r vector going to minus r vector with t held fixed. Okay, if you do that, then you can check that the equation would be invariant under this transformation also, and as a result, parity is also symmetry of this problem. Okay, since this is just the magnitude of the vector, it wouldn't be affected by swapping the vector or even rotating a vector by some angle. Okay, because it's only the magnitude that matters. Okay, now of course parity operator squares to 1 implies that the eigenvalues of parity are plus or minus 1, uh, and uh, and what we'll do is that we can use this, since the problem has rotational symmetry, we will use spherical polar coordinate system, and the spherical polar coordinate system, the parity transformation corresponds to r going to r, theta going to pi minus theta. Remember, this is the polar angle, and phi going to pi plus phi, which is phi is the azimuthal angle. Okay, that means it's angle in xy plane, and this is angle about the z axis. Okay, so parity transformation corresponds to this statement. If you try to see what this transformation corresponds to on a sphere, this transformation takes you from one point on the sphere to its antipodal point. Okay, diametrically opposite point on the sphere. Okay, that's what the parity transformation would do. Okay, we have already studied spherical harmonics in QM1 course, and I'm sure in maybe even in electrodynamics, this thing. And the spherical harmonics have a property that under parity transformation, the YLM theta phi would go to -1 to the L times YLM theta phi. Okay, so of course, YLM theta phi would go to YLM pi minus theta pi plus phi, but that is same as -1 to the L times YLM theta phi. That is the statement. Okay, fine. So these are the properties that the spherical harmonics have. Okay, so we want to ask a question that what is the action of the parity operator on the full wave function? Okay, so let's put it this way, that if a parity operator acts on the wave function, it gives you a new wave function with respect to new coordinate. It is supposed to be r prime vector. It looks a bit messy. Where of course r prime vector is just minus of r, because that is what the parity transformation is, minus r vector. Okay, so that is what it would give. It is a new function of a new variable. Okay, so where of course parity operator acting on space squares to 1, but parity operator on the Hilbert space is some unitary operator p. Okay, I'm using the same notation for both of them, but clearly there's not much confusion with this. Okay, hopefully. Okay, so we want to ask what is this operator. Okay, now although the wave functions transform in this fashion, that means the operator acts only from the left. If you ask how do the operators acting on Hilbert space transform, and they transform by what is called conjugation. Okay, that means O goes to O prime, which is P O P inverse. Okay, and that is, and this transformation P O P inverse is the operation called conjugation. Okay, uh, I mean, I'm sure we have encountered this in various quantum mechanics courses. Okay, so let's look at the Dirac Hamiltonian when for the hydrogen atom problem. Okay, fine. So so the thing is that remember, if you don't put phi of r, then the Dirac Hamiltonian is a Hamiltonian for a free particle. Okay, we are not looking at the vector potential at all. So it's a free particle problem, and the free particle problem definitely should be parity invariant. There is nothing specific to choose in any spatial direction, flat spatial direction for a free particle. Okay, so but you know that under parity transformation, p vector would go to minus p vector. Okay, which essentially tells you that if you take Hamiltonian operator and conjugate that with p, okay, and where capital P is the parity operator, whereas small p vector is the momentum operator, okay, then it better anti-commute with alpha, so that when you take the capital P operator through alpha, it gives you a minus sign, and then when it goes acts on P, it gives you another minus sign, such that alpha dot P is invariant. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we basically want to determine P as an operator, capital P as an operator. So free particle tells you that it should anti-commute with alpha vector, but it should commute with beta MC squared. Okay. In case of free particles. Okay. This is just a function. So this is multiplied by an identity matrix. Right? Alpha, beta are 4x4 matrices. This is also multiplied by a 4x4 identity matrix. And of course, identity matrix would not affect anything. It will not tell you what P would be, okay, because PPV inverse would be just 1. Okay, good. So you want an operator which anti-commutes with alpha but commutes with beta. Okay, so that is clearly an operator matrix which is beta. Okay, if you have a beta matrix, it will anti-commute with alpha, but it kind of commutes with beta, because if you just multiply, remember beta inverse is beta itself. So you write down beta, beta, beta inverse, that is same as beta. Okay, so so therefore, the representation of parity operation on the Dirac spinorial space is given by the matrix, gamma matrix, which we will call gamma 0 or call it beta in the alpha beta notation. Okay, so therefore P of R sorry, P acting on psi of R is given by beta times psi of minus R. Okay. So what is this function psi prime is now determined. Okay. We know that R prime vector is just minus of R. Okay. But psi prime was a new function, and that new function is determined by this beta matrix. Okay. So now, of course, we have chosen a basis in which beta matrix is diagonal 1 minus 1. So that tells you that the upper two components of psi remain what they are, except R goes to minus R. The lower two components of psi would change sign along with R going to minus R. Okay, that is the actual operation of P on the wave function. Okay, is this point clear? So besides doing the spatial transformation that R vector goes to minus R vector, it also acts on the wave function, on the spin or part of the wave function. Okay, and that transformation is determined by beta. Okay, so let's continue. So what do we learn from this? We learn that so of course parity. We have just established this, that parity would actually commute with the Hamiltonian, because we determined how this matrix would be by saying that it commutes with the Hamiltonian. Okay, so at the end of this small computation, we find that the simultaneously diagonalizable set of operators are Hamiltonian itself, the total angular momentum J, its Z component. This is something we already knew. I mean, even in non-relativistic quantum mechanics, and the parity operator. Okay. Now, since we already know that the Dirac particle has spin half. Okay. So if you look at the spin quantum number, okay, whenever we encounter this, we'll just replace that by corresponding eigenvalues by treating Dirac particle as spin half particle. So we therefore get J is equal to L plus or minus half, because the operator J was written as the operator L plus operator S. Okay, so therefore this J would be by addition of angular momenta would be L plus or minus the S value, which of course is half. Okay, so the important thing that we learn from here is that if you fix the J value, okay, so suppose you fix, say, J value to be say 3/2. Okay, then for a J value to be 3/2, you can either have L value to be 1 or you can have L value to be 2. Okay, so 1 plus half gives you 3/2, as well as 2 minus half would give you 3/2. Okay, but what it tells us is that if you fix the J value, then there are two states whose L values differs by 1. Okay, right? Either L is equal to 2 or L is equal to 1 give you J equals 3/2. Okay, but let's go back a little and recall that the spherical harmonics had the property that they were minus 1 to the L times the spherical harmonics. It's the original spherical harmonic under parity transformation. Okay, so therefore, for a fixed value of J, you have two different L value states of opposite parity. Okay, so if you fix a J value, then one state would have even parity under one state would be even under parity transformation. The other state would be odd under parity transformation. Okay, for the same J. Okay.
So
Yes.
just one second. This J is the eigenvalue of the operator J, right?
Yes.
And that operator J enters the equation as J dot B.
Yeah.
So isn't that operator L plus 2S?
No. J is no. J is defined as L plus S. The operator which couples B is J plus 2S. Okay.
J plus S or L plus 2S basically.
Sorry, L plus, excuse me. Thank you. It is J plus S there. And that is because the gyromagnetic ratios for orbital versus spin angular momentum are different. That's why the coupling is L plus 2s. Okay.
Yeah, but J is still defined as L plus
J is
S.
always defined as L plus S. Yeah. So maybe I should have gone back and shown that thing. We had done this earlier.
Or was it that the derivative is 0 and
Which derivative?
the commutator bracket when we write it for the operator?
No. The definition of J is just L plus S. There is no. Gosh. Maybe I haven't defined it at all. Sorry, I have not defined it, but yeah, J is of course L plus S. Okay, so the coupling to the external magnetic field would be J plus S actually.
Then, okay, under the magnetic field, it does not commute, right?
Does not commute
It's
what?
Hamiltonian. J.
No. Why?
Because S does not commute, does it? I don't know.
No. J would commute with S also, right? See, if you apply a magnetic field, it's a vectorial thing, right? You can choose that direction to be Z direction, and then SZ and JZ are simultaneously diagonalizable objects, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, any other question at this point? Okay, then let's kind of do the same stuff that we did for Schrodinger and Klein-Gordon equation, namely employ a separation of variables, and we will assume that it will work here also. Well, we don't have to assume; we can of course show it explicitly, but at least if you expect, then you can at least look for a separation of variable procedure. Okay, so what we will do is we'll assume that the wave function would split into this form. Okay, and what we need to show is that the Hamiltonian actually splits into the radial part of the part and angular part. Okay, if the Hamiltonian can be split into that form, then this product representation of the wave function makes sense. Okay, so right now we will of course assume this to be true, but we will kind of establish these things step by step. Okay, fine. So that's what I am saying, that we'll have to separate that into a radial and angular part. Okay, so let's do this in a bit slowly. So first thing is that you can write down R square as alpha dot R times alpha dot R. Okay, now remember alpha had the product relation which was alpha I alpha j is equal to delta ij plus epsilon ij k alpha k. Okay, that was the kind of relation. If I can try to spot that relation, I can do that. You may have to go a bit behind for this. In case if you are J was defined way above actually somewhere. Okay, I think somewhere here. Oh. Sorry, it's taking just too much time. Yeah, sorry, I am not able to spot it, but if anybody can spot it in the notes, please let me know. Okay, but I had seen the sigma.
It was done, I think, at the beginning of Dirac equation.
right in the beginning, is it?
Yes, yes. In the beginning of Dirac equation.
Oh, well, I'm almost there at the beginning of the stuff. Well, not really. Okay, let it be. It is basically the same relation that the Pauli matrices satisfy. So I thought this was written somewhere, but since I'm not able to spot it. Okay, so anyway, alpha matrices satisfy exactly same relation. Okay, so let me just keep this on the screen. It's exactly same relation. Now you look at this expression, and if you utilize this relation, you write down this piece as alpha I Ri times alpha j Rj. Then you have alpha I alpha j. That can be delta Ij or epsilon Ij k alpha k. Okay. Now the point is that, like, if you have epsilon Ij k alpha k, then there's a epsilon Ij Ri Rj, but that is kind of the epsilon is antisymmetric and R would be symmetric with his indices, and that piece cancels out. Okay, so therefore you could have in principle had a cross term, but that term for R would just vanish. Okay, and that's why R squared is just written in this particular form. Okay, fine. So therefore, if you want to write down R squared times alpha dot P, then you will write this expression as alpha dot R times alpha dot R times alpha dot P. Okay. Fair enough, right? Given that R squared is written in this way, you can just plug it in. Okay. Now what we'll do is we know what happens with first two product terms, that will just give you R squared. But what we'll do is the second and third piece. Okay. And we take those two pieces and use the alpha matrix identity. Okay. So now, because we have R vector and P vector, the cross term wouldn't vanish. Okay. And we will keep that piece now. Okay. So let's do that. Okay. So of course, left hand side is R squared alpha dot P. Right hand side, we are manipulating alpha dot R with alpha dot P. Okay. So one alpha dot R stays as it is as a spectator, and the other two pieces would give you delta Ij would give you R dot P. Okay. Whereas epsilon Ijk is like a cross product, right? Epsilon Ijk, say Rjpk would be like R cross P term. Okay. Right. So what you end up with is a term which is R dot P plus I times sigma operator dotted with R cross P, where sigma operator is the antisymmetric product of two alpha matrices. Okay, fine. So yeah, so that is the reason why I wanted the alpha matrix relation really, but doesn't matter. Okay, so what you get is an expression like this. Okay. But now we notice that R cross P is the angular momentum part. Okay. So therefore this term would just turn out to be sigma dot L. Okay. Whereas R dot P would project onto the momentum in the radial direction. Okay. Times of course the magnitude of the radius. Okay. So that gives you R times del del R. Okay. Minus I bar is just a part of momentum fellow. Okay. What is alpha dot R? Well, if you choose the radial basis, even for the alpha matrices, then it is just R times the alpha times the R component of the alpha vector, right? Normally we look at alpha matrix as alpha X, alpha Y, alpha Z, or alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3 or something. But instead of using Cartesian coordinates, suppose you choose to write alpha matrices in the polar coordinates, then they will be called alpha R, alpha theta, alpha phi, right? And of those alpha matrices, only alpha R is going to show up. Okay, so this piece becomes R times alpha R, and this piece becomes R del del R plus sigma dot L. Okay, up to some factors of I's and H bars, which are written out here. Okay, is this fine?
So how did we write that alpha again?
Alpha R?
Yeah, like how would it look like in a matrix form?
Yeah. So I'll show you the matrix form at some point. First of all, it's up to you as to what matrix form you want to use there really, because as I said that there are about 15 gamma matrices which are 4 by 4 traceless with eigenvalue plus or minus 1. Okay, so which one you want to choose depends upon what is the choice of basis within that those set of gamma matrices you make. Okay. Now, of course, this choice would be related to a choice that you made with alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, because X, Y, Z component are related to R component in a very specific fashion, that you kind of choose a R vector as, R unit vector as X upon R vector plus Y upon R vector plus Z upon R vector multiplied by I, J, K, or stuff like that. So, so if you start with a specific alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha 3, you can determine alpha R by using that vectorial property. What we will do is not do that. We will just choose a basis in which alpha R would take a convenient value. Okay. Is that fine?
My question was that suppose like in order to do something like this, I think we have to like express R itself as R theta phi instead of x1, x2, x3.
Yes. Yes.
So corresponding to alpha dot R, it is alpha vector.
Yeah.
Will be something like alpha R 0, 0
Alpha R.
as a vector alpha.
No. Alpha as a vector is alpha R, comma alpha theta, comma alpha phi.
Yeah, so shouldn't those terms show up something like theta plus alpha theta and all?
No. When you take a dot product of with a R vector, okay, then only the R component of that is going to show up. No, it's just a dot product thing, right?
Yeah, but
No, what is the issue? There are no theta and phi component coming here because this product has to be rotationally invariant, right?
yeah, I'm getting confused with the notation. I think it'll maybe get cleared up later.
Okay.
He's thinking R as X plus Y plus J, and then
Yeah. Even if
Actually-
you do it in that form, you should still be able to reach this point.
yeah, but that is very, complicated.
It's a
That is what-
complicated computation, yes.
Yeah.
But well,
If-
complicated means what? Like, about 5-6 line computation maybe.
Yeah, then that would mix up the components. That is what his point
No,
is.
it won't. No, it won't. No.
No, the final result will be this, but
Yeah.
it will be
Intermediate steps would have all kinds of fellows sitting around, but they will cancel out. Yes, that I agree. That if you do step by step, starting from Cartesian to polar coordinates, remember that just requires you to kind of plug in all kinds of direction cosines, which converts, gives a relation between two curvilinear coordinate systems. You must have done in some math method course at BSc level actually, that how different curvilinear coordinates are related, and you have to write down these H's. Hello.
Yeah, sir.
Yeah, sorry. As usual, HRI internet has kind of gone again. Can you see the file again?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I mean, since morning it has been going on and off. Either power goes off or the net goes off. So anyway, so now I'm back on my phone connection actually. So I hope it will work till the end of this class at least. After that, I don't care until Monday. I mean, really. Okay, so what I was saying was that, like, of course, if you go from Cartesian coordinates to spherical polar coordinates, you need to do this change of coordinates using curvilinear coordinate system, and you have direction cosines to kind of relate the unit vectors in one coordinate system to another coordinate system. You'll have to go through all that exercise if you do this. Okay. But what you need to basically realize is that this inner product is rotationally invariant and therefore shouldn't depend on thetas and phi's. Okay. And if it doesn't depend on theta and phi, then by purely dimension counting, it has to be proportional to r, because r vector has dimension of length. Okay. Times the quantity which has to be projecting only along the r vector direction, which has to be alpha r. If it has any theta and phi dependence, then the dot product would actually depend on the direction of the depend on theta and phi, and that of course is of course cannot be true, because dot product is a scalar quantity with respect to rotation. Okay, so of course one can do first principle computation starting from Cartesian coordinate system and arrive at that. That's a longish process, but physics tells you that this is all you would have actually. Okay, does that kind of explain the point?
Yeah, the result seems fair, but I mean, I'm not sure about the computation, but okay, I'll work it out.
Yeah, it should be possible to work out actually. Yeah. Uh, in fact, some other computation also we will kind of land up with, which should also require you to kind of go from Cartesian to polar coordinates to actually arrive at the result. In fact, that's an exercise that that will be there in this class. Uh, if you do that exercise, that will kind of partly explain this point also. Okay, so let's go ahead a little and we'll see what happens. Okay, so what we did was that, we wrote this expression by writing alpha dot r times alpha dot p and then played around with that. But one can give a little more elegant representation by realizing that you can define the r component of the momentum as projection of the momentum operator in the r direction. Okay, and you symmetrize that. Okay, so you write half of r dot p plus p dot r, where r is a unit vector. Okay, if you do that, then you need to just work this out. You will get the answer, which is minus I h bar times del del r plus 1 by r. Okay, now this is something that you would have seen in curvilinear linear coordinate system, that the radial component of the derivative appears as 1 over r del del r times r. Okay, this expression is same as this expression. Okay, so the exercise is the following. I suppose this exercise immediately, that you need to show that if you take p dot r hat, okay, remember in quantum mechanics, if you take this as an operator, it can act on r hat itself, or it would go through and act on whatever is on the right of that, okay, like wave function or something. So you can write down p dot r hat is equal to r hat dot p, that means when p doesn't act on r hat, and the other piece when p actually acts on r hat. Okay, and that piece will give you 2 by r. Okay, doing this exercise is essentially same as doing the other exercise. Okay, so if you can get this result, okay, then you would know how to get the other result also. Okay, now of course this factor of 2 cancels the factor of half here, and therefore you get just 1 by r a piece. Okay, so that is the result for this PR. Okay, so what we could do is that use that manipulation. Is there any question? Okay, so what we can do then is that we can write down alpha dot p. Remember, we had written as r squared alpha dot p is equal to some quantity. So now I have taken r squared down in the denominator on the right hand side. So alpha dot p is 1 over r squared times alpha dot r times r dot p times plus this piece. Okay, this is something we derived just in a previous slide. Okay, good. Okay, so okay, so all I have to do now is to basically simplify this expression. You remember alpha dot r was r times alpha r. That r cancels one of the r's. The remaining r, I just push it inside this bracket and convert this r vector into a unit vector. Okay, and here I just convert, just write down 1 over R and convert R cross P into L vector. Okay, so this is the kind of term that you get. So alpha dot P can be written in this particular form. Okay, so now you see that in this particular form, you have a radial part sitting out here and the angular part is sitting out here. Okay, so when you substitute it back into the Dirac equation, remember Dirac equation contains C times alpha dot P piece, we can kind of utilize this form to extract the angular part out and keep the radial part uh, for the radial part of the equation. Okay. Fine. So of course, R dot P itself again can be written in this particular form simply because you are just trying to project the momentum operator in the radial direction, and that is this quantity. Okay. But del del R was something we had evaluated some time ago, which is this. Okay. So minus I h bar del del R is equal to PR plus I h bar by R. Okay. You can just push this factor on the other side and write down del del R is equal to PR plus I h bar upon R. Okay, good. So take that and write down alpha dot R. So maybe I can move this out now. Okay, so remember this is the equation on the top. R hat dot P is written as this quantity, which is written as PR plus I h bar upon R. Okay, put this back into the R dot P expression and you get alpha dot P is equal to alpha R PR plus I upon R times sigma dot L plus H bar. Okay, so there's a shift in sigma dot L piece by H bar. Okay, so that is the answer that we get. Is that okay? So what we want to do is to look at the angular part of the problem at some point and just plug in its eigenvalues here. Once you plug in the eigenvalue here, then this piece plus I over R times that eigenvalue would involve only radial part of the equation. Okay, exactly the way we did it in, say, Schrodinger equation case, that you had a 1 over R squared times the radial part, sorry, angular part of the Laplacian. You solve the angular part of the Laplacian, plug in its eigenvalue there, and you write down something like L into L plus 1 upon R squared and try to solve the radial part of the equation. Okay, we'll do the same stuff here. Okay, it's just that earlier they were just differential operators, but now you also have matrix operators. Okay, simply because your wave function is not simple function, but it's a matrix valued or column vector valued wave function. Okay, fine. Okay, so of course in this form you see the sigma dot L, which is the spin orbit coupling in the problem. Okay, so that is kind of explicitly pulled out of the alpha dot P interaction as alpha dot P term. Okay, so any questions here? Okay, if not, then we can go ahead. So so let's write down J as L plus S, and remember S was written as H bar by 2 times sigma about a couple of lectures ago actually. So we write it in terms of sigma now. So if you do that, then you can compute J squared by using this representation of J, and J squared would be given by L squared plus H bar squared by 4 times sigma squared plus the cross term, which is H bar times L dot sigma. Okay. This is a usual manipulation that we have done even in the non-relativistic physics, quantum mechanics, when we studied addition of angular momenta. J squared is L plus L whole squared, which is L squared plus S squared plus 2L dot S. Okay, this is precisely that. Okay, so we can write down L dot S, in this particular case L dot sigma, to be 1 over h bar times j squared minus L squared minus h bar squared by 4 times sigma squared. Okay, same manipulation. Only thing that I'm doing after that is that I use the fact that Dirac particle is a spin half particle. Okay. Now, in non-relativistic quantum mechanics, we would just keep S as whatever S value, depending upon what is the problem that you look at, you can decide what is the S value that you want to choose. Okay. If you are looking at only the problem involving electron, of course, you will substitute S is equal to half. But maybe if you are looking at something else, you could substitute S equal to 1, 3, half, whatever. Okay. That kind of freedom you don't have here because you are looking at Dirac particle, which is a spin half particle. Story ends there. Okay. So therefore, what we are going to do here is that we will substitute the eigenvalue of sigma by 2, which is the spin operator, sigma, to be 3/4. Okay. Remember, eigenvalues are s into s plus 1 and s is equal to half. So half into half plus 1 would give you 3/4. Okay. Fine. So this is the only place where we are using the fact that Dirac particle is a spin half particle and kind of getting rid of the sigma squared piece. Okay. Good. So once we are through with that, then we can use this to kind of write down L dot sigma in a little better fashion. Remember, we actually encounter L dot sigma plus h bar. Okay. That is the operator that we encountered here, L dot sigma plus h bar. Okay. Fine. So I want to write down L dot sigma plus h bar now. Okay. So that just requires adding h bar on both sides. This was initially minus 3/4 h bar squared. Okay. So that gives you, but of course, remember there's a 1 over h bar sitting around here. So if you add a h bar here, you are and add a h bar here, you are actually adding a h bar square inside. Okay. So
Sir,
yes.
in the second step, this L dot sigma,
Yeah.
the third thing,
This
h
step or
cross
this?
square, yeah, the above one.
This one.
Yeah, there shouldn't be the 4 here, right?
Why?
Because you have set sigma equals to half plus sigma as half times
No.
1 plus half.
Sigma by 2 gives you half into half plus 1.
Oh, okay.
Remember, spin operator is defined by polymatrix by 2, not polymatrix itself.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
So similarly
Yeah.
here, the spin operator is defined by sigma by 2 and not by sigma itself.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, and that is why you get half into half plus 1. Okay.
Fine, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So we now just kind of add h bar on both sides, and that gives you minus 3/4 to plus 1/4. Some trivial manipulation. Okay. And now we say that, like, okay, if you look at this operator on the right hand side and act it on a wave function which has simultaneous eigenfunctions of various these operators, we just substitute its eigenvalues. Okay. So I haven't written all those words, but like that's what we basically do. You act this operator on the wave function and get this answer. Okay. So whenever j acts on the state, you get j into j plus 1 times h bar squared. So that is the reason why the h bar goes from the denominator. Okay. And you get j into j plus 1 minus L into L plus 1 plus this 1/4. Okay. Good. So now we know that for a given L value, there are two j values. Okay. L plus or minus half. Right. This is something we had done some time ago. Maybe you can just roll back and when we talked about the parity thing, j is equal to L plus or minus half. Okay. So we'll utilize this fact and put it back there here. Okay. So when you substitute j is equal to L plus half, then this entire quantity inside the square bracket just becomes L plus 1. Okay. Whereas if you substitute j is equal to L minus half, then this entire quantity becomes just minus L. Okay. So that is, So eigenvalues of sigma dot L plus H bar are either L plus 1 or minus L, okay, for a given J value. Okay, fine. So now notice one thing that, yeah, so notice one thing that these states, I mean, these eigenvalues have kind of opposite parity. If L has a fixed parity, then minus 1 to the L or minus 1 to the minus L would have the same parity. On the other hand, minus 1 to the L plus 1 would have a different parity. Okay, so if you try to kind of utilize this kind of operator, it would tell you that the states would have opposite parity. But that is something we had already learned earlier, that for a fixed J value, the states would have had opposite parity, right? Okay. So we can basically see it once again through this operator. Okay. So let us now look at the square of this operator. Okay. So if you try to square the operator, now remember that this is L dot S kind of operator. Okay. So it's not like, you have a vector operator, J vector, and then you square it, and that squaring is basically writing down J dot J. This is already a scalar quantity. Okay. So we are literally squaring the scalar quantity. Okay. So if you take a square of this quantity, then you get L dot sigma squared plus H bar squared plus 2 times H bar times L dot sigma. Okay. Now you can kind of write down these pieces explicitly. Remember, sigma matrices also have similar product property like the alpha matrices, and therefore it tells you that sigma I sigma j would give you delta ij, which gives you L dot L piece, and it also gives you a term which is I times epsilon ij k sigma k, and that gives you this piece. Okay. So this quantity has a delta ij piece and an epsilon ijk piece. The epsilon ijk piece gives you L cross L, but L cross L is like a commutator of L. Okay, because epsilon ijk would ensure that you are taking a commutator of these two components of these two L's. Okay, and that of course we can write as again I times another L. Okay, I epsilon times another L. Okay, so what we will do is we'll convert this to one more L. Okay, using the Lie algebra relation between angular momentum generators. Okay, so what happens in the process is that this piece, okay, will give you one more term. This piece gives you L squared. Okay, uh, you get a sigma dot L term with a I factor, which with this I gives you a minus sign, cancels this factor of 2 and gives you a factor of 1. Okay, I seem to have kind of missed the factor of sigma H bar here. Okay, so but if I include H bar here, L cross L would of course have I H bar times the epsilon times another L. So that is the one which gives you this L bar, H bar. Okay, but this term comes with a minus sign and this term is plus 2, gives you one term. Okay, and of course the H bar square goes for a ride. Okay, good. So then you can write down this expression as L plus H bar by 2 sigma whole squared plus H bar squared by 4. Okay. Now here again I have used the fact that sigma squared or sigma by 2 whole squared would give you the answer 3 by 4, which is what we used here. Okay. We use sigma squared by 4 giving 3 by 4 as the answer. Okay. So the same thing we will do here. That if you expand this piece, then it will contain a L squared piece, then it will contain a cross term, which is L dot sigma piece. Okay, that L dot sigma piece will come twice, it will take care of factor of 2 and gives you this term. Okay, and then you have a H bar squared times sigma by 2 whole squared piece. Okay, that term is h bar squared times 3/4. Okay, right? But what you want is h bar squared. Okay, so therefore you write this quantity as h bar squared times 3/4 plus h bar squared times 1/4. Okay, so if you put all of them together, you reproduce this h bar squared piece. Okay, so the upshot of this is that square of this operator is written in terms of L plus h bar by 2 times sigma. But we know what is L plus h bar by 2 times sigma. Just wrote it here. Okay, L plus h bar by 2 times sigma is j. Okay, so we'll end up with the j operator. Okay, so this operator L dot sigma plus h bar whole squared is just j squared plus h bar squared by 4. Okay, is this fine? Some technical manipulation, but I hope it is easy to follow. It's not that difficult actually.
Yes, sir, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. So now what we learn from this is that the operator L dot sigma plus h bar would commute with j. Okay, because it squares to itself. So definitely the squared operator commutes with j squared. Okay, and so therefore what you find is that the eigenvalues of this operator are kind of simultaneous eigenvalues with respect to the eigenstates of j operator. Okay, so j squared, if you write down eigenstates of j squared, then you can simultaneously write them as eigenstates of square of this operator. Okay, kind of trivial. Okay, fine. So you can check that given this relation, okay, eigenvalues of this operator are given by j plus half whole squared. Okay, it is j plus half whole squared. Okay, I have not put a bracket between j plus 1 and so on. Okay, so now that's kind of easy to see. If you take j and act it on some state, then it will give you j into j plus 1, which expands as j squared plus j plus 1/4. But j squared plus j plus 1/4 is actually j plus half whole squared. Okay, everybody has a h bar squared which just sits outside. Okay, so this quantity j squared as an operator plus 1/4 is same as j plus half whole squared. Okay, so the eigenvalue of this operator is j plus 1, j plus half whole squared times h bar. Okay.
So would you scroll to the previous slide?
Yes, sure.
One more.
One more. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any question about it?
No, I was just looking at the operator.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Okay.
So,
Yes.
one thing, like we are saying, sigma square sums up to 3h square by 4.
Yeah.
Because Dirac, electron is spin-off particle, but
Yes.
it follows simply from the definition of sigma, right? Because we defined sigma as alpha I alpha j minus alpha j alpha I,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yes.
And if we squared the matrix and sum up to 1, it should sum them up. It should automatically give us 3h square by 4, right?
Yeah, true. So sigma, if you want to know what sigma squared would contribute, it will contribute 3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like, why do we have to say that it follows because electron is spin-off particle?
Oh, because sigma by itself is not the operator which acts correctly. It's a sigma by 2. I mean, it's a question of normalization of generators of the symmetry algebra. Okay, when you study group theory, Lie algebra and representation theory, you will learn that all these things are related to correctly normalizing the operator, the generators of the algebra. Okay, so with respect to a correct choice of generators, you get a correct algebra. To put it a little differently, if you take sigma I sigma j commutator, then you get 2 times epsilon ij k sigma k, whereas the SU2 Lie algebra commutation relation is Ji Jj is equal to epsilon I jk, maybe factor of I, that is not important. I is related to hermiticity condition. Okay, so the factor of 2 that you get in the Pauli matrices is tells you that you get a different factor. But if you divide everything by 4, then if you and write down sigma by 2, sigma I by 2 commutator with sigma j by 2, then it gives you I epsilon I j k sigma k by 2 naturally.
I'm talking about the factor of 3. Uh,
Okay.
Actually, if it was some other spin, spin 3 by 2 particle,
Yeah.
we would expect it to be 3 by 2 into 3 by 2 plus half.
Yes.
And but this we should not expect from squaring sigma, squaring the sigmas, because sigma was defined to be commutator of alpha and
Yes.
commutator of alpha I and alpha j.
Yes.
So whenever we square the matrix,
Yeah.
and since there are 3 components, like 3 directions,
Yeah.
we should always get a factor of 3.
No. That's not right. It is not acting on space. It is acting on the spin space actually. Okay. So that is why if you take spin 3/2 particle, you are not using Dirac equation for that. It's a different equation and it has a different operator, and it will give you an answer which is related to 3/2 thing, 3/2 into 3/2 plus 1. Okay.
Okay.
It is not the same sigma thing. So this sigma operator acts on the spin space, nothing to do with space time really. Okay. It so turns out that in 3 dimensions, the component number of components for the spin this thing is same as the number of components that the ordinary vector has. But suppose you go to say other dimensions. Okay. For example, if you are in let's take some other thing. Suppose you are in 6 dimensions. Okay. Then in 6 dimensions, your vector is 6 component, but your spinor is still 4 component actually. Or if you write down a Dirac spinor, it will be 8 component. Okay. So it looks different. The matrices would be 8 by 8 matrices. And if you try to kind of compute those quantities, it would apparently give you a different answer. Okay. So it's not like that actually. So there are six matrices. When you write down sigma vector, okay, well, if you're looking at spatial part of it in 6 dimension, sigma vector would be 5 such matrices. Okay, acting on 8 component spinor. Okay, so it's not like it's not obvious that simply because you have 3 of these guys that it will give you answer 3. Okay. It is related to the fact that you are actually acting on a spin half Hilbert space. Anything else? So there are a lot of coincidences in 3 dimensions, which have been, of course, exploited also in physics for various other exotic results. That the 3-dimensional space has 3 component vector and internal symmetry corresponding to spin, also has 3 generators. These facts have been used to get some exotic results in physics. This thing. But we may talk about it at some point, but not in this course. Okay. Like for example, just to kind of give a glimpse of it, that we just learned that Lorentz algebra can be written as 2 copies of SU2 symmetries, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Now suppose you are studying a theory which has SU2 symmetry in addition. Okay. Like standard model has one of the groups of standard model is SU2. Okay, it is like SU3 cross SU2 cross U1 kind of symmetry. So it contains a SU2 symmetry. Okay. Now you may want to ask a question that can I find out a solution which mixes one of these SU2 with the SU2 of the standard model? It doesn't happen in standard model although, but you could ask a question for some other SU2 gauge theory. And the answer is yes, you could do that. You can find out some exotic solution. And in which case it mixes quantum numbers of space-time versus of internal quantum numbers. Okay. Now, this kind of exotic stuff is possible in 3+1 dimensions. It is not so easily possible in higher dimensions, simply because dimensionality of the Lorentz group and the dimensionality of the spinor space changes quite differently. Vector dimension of the vector changes linearly, whereas dimension of the spinor space jumps by 2 to the d factors. We had discussed this some time ago, right? So they don't agree beyond certain dimensions, really. Okay. So a lot of interesting coincidences in 3 spatial dimensions, but yeah. Okay, any other question? Okay, if not, then let's go ahead. So what we found was that, like, given that this quantity is same as j squared plus some number, clearly this fellow would commute with j squared. Okay, so that's kind of obvious. Okay, but the operator doesn't commute with the Hamiltonian. Okay, and the reason why it doesn't commute with Hamiltonian is because Hamiltonian contains alpha matrices and sigma matrices don't commute with alpha matrices, because sigma matrices are some kind of cross products of alpha matrices, and alpha matrices have cross products with themselves to be non-trivial. Okay, so clearly this object doesn't commute with the Hamiltonian. Okay, but there is an operator which we call h bar times k, which is the same operator multiplied by beta matrix. Okay, once you write this operator, then that commutes with the Hamiltonian. Okay, now notice that this beta fellow has no role to play as far as j squared commutation relation is concerned. Okay, so therefore k does commute with j, but the advantage of this k operator against this operator L dot sigma plus h bar is that this fellow commutes with the Hamiltonian. Okay, is that fine? Okay, so here's the exercise that you have to show that this k operator that we have written down. Okay, so I have stripped off the h bar factor. Okay, you have to show that that commutes with the Hamiltonian. Okay, if you want, you can keep a h bar, it doesn't matter, anyway it commutes. Okay, fine. And nice exercise to kind of figure out how to manipulate alpha beta matrices as well as sigma matrices. Okay, any questions here? Okay, if not, then let's continue. So now notice that, k operator is effectively only this operator. Okay, and this operator is same as j squared plus h squared, h bar squared by 4. Okay, so therefore we can ask what are the eigenvalues of k operator, and the answer is the k operator has eigenvalues plus or minus j plus half. Okay, and those eigenvalues go from plus minus 1, plus minus 2, dot dot dot, like that. Okay, the value k is equal to 0 does not occur because the smallest value j can take is half, right? Because j is L plus S, and if you can take L is equal to 0, but S is half. Okay, so the smallest j value that you would get is j is equal to half. Okay, and therefore you could write down this answer starting from plus minus 1, plus minus 2, and so on. Okay, is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So of course we are going to use this fact because k is the fellow which is sitting in the alpha dot p expression. Remember? Sorry, I'm kind of scrolling back a lot, but alpha dot p basically has a k sitting here. Okay. Now this is not really k because you have to multiply by beta, but that is okay. You just multiply by beta squared. Beta squared is 1. So then you get this quantity to be beta times k, because 1 beta times this expression is k and the other beta is sitting around there. So you get an expression I beta times k upon r. That is the kind of expression that we will use. Okay, good. So let's scroll down. Okay, good. So now this basically takes care of what the angular part of the equation would do. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll start looking at the radial part of the equation. Okay, any question at this point? Okay, if not, let's kind of look at the radial part of the equation. Radial part of the equation now takes this form: C times alpha r PR plus I times alpha r beta times eigenvalue of this operator K times this h bar C are factors which are sitting around there. Remember, there's a h bar times K is the operator, really. Okay, so that's why you get h bar times K, and a C was sitting outside alpha dot P. So there's a C sitting around here, and a 1 over R is something we had derived. And rest all pieces are as it is. They are just sitting and watching what happens with alpha dot P factor so far. Okay, and that is equal to the energy eigenvalue times the radial part of the wave function. Okay, so this is the analog of the radial part of the wave function that we would solve in the Schrodinger problem, for example. Okay, good. So what we'll do is we'll kind of assume R to be a 2-component spinor. Okay, it's actually a 4-component spinor, but we'll write it in the 2-component form. Okay, it'll the function g and f will come with ordinary polyspinor multiplying it eventually, but that piece we are not interested in right now because that piece is already taken care of by the angular part of the problem. Okay, this form of writing R in the 2-component form derives from the fact that the first order part of the first order form of the equation, Dirac equation, appears with upper component and lower component related to each other by derivative. Okay, so that you actually have a second order differential equation. Okay, if you put these fellows together. Okay, so that's why to make it explicit, you write it in 2-component form. This factor of 1 over R kind of straightens out a few terms when you actually expand the expression. Okay. Just a second. Okay, fine. So now what we are going to do is to choose beta to be whatever we had chosen earlier, namely 1 minus 1. And we are going to take alpha r to be 0 minus I 0. Okay, these are all 2 by 2 matrices, 1 or I or minus I, they are 2 by 2 matrices. But as far as our problem is concerned, you can just treat them as just simple numerical entries. Okay, fine. Their action on the additional spinor sitting around here is of no consequence right now. Okay, so we take this. The advantage, the reason for choosing alpha r to be this, we have a lot of choice, as I said. The reason for choosing this is that, remember that PR would come with minus IH bar del R kind of piece. Similarly, there's an I sitting around here. So if you choose alpha R to carry I factors, then the eventual differential equation would not contain any I factors. Okay, so it will look like a ordinary differential equation without any complex parameters sitting around. Okay, that is one advantage of choosing alpha R to be this way. Okay, fine. Okay, so once you choose that, all you have to do is to just plug these matrices up into this equation, put them there, simplify the expression, and just write down 2 equations, one for the upper component, one for the lower component. Okay, and here are the 2 equations. Okay, so you get E minus MC squared plus ZE squared by R times G plus H bar C times the derivative of F with respect to R plus H bar C K F times R, F divided by R is equal to 0. That is one equation. Now they are coupled equations. Remember, one piece contains upper component two pieces contain lower components. Okay. The second equation is the other way around, that E plus mc squared plus Z squared by R multiplies the lower component, and minus h bar c del g by del R plus h bar c kg upon R contains upper component. Okay. And setting this equation to 0 in this choice of basis reduces to these two equations. Okay. And we want to solve this. Now notice that, like, these are ordinary differential equations now, because the radial part is the only thing that is relevant here. Angular part has already been solved and its eigenvalue is sitting around here. Okay. Fine. Any questions at this point? Okay. If not, then let's go ahead. So we want to, of course, solve these differential equations. And to solve these equations, we basically have to study their singularity structure. Okay. So I suppose you must have done this in the first course of in mathematical methods last year. Have you studied the singularity structures of differential
Not
equations?
at all.
Not at all. Oh, I see. Okay. So let's do the following thing. Okay. Let's take this set of equations, and I can at least tell you why r equals 0 and r equals infinity are singular points. Okay. That would at least suffice for computing these equations. Yeah, it's a bit of that's kind of sad. Yeah, I don't feel comfortable. Let's do one thing. I can resolve this issue for this set of this couple differential equation in no time. Right now, we'll do that. Okay, but I think it's a good idea to get for you people to know how singularity analysis of differential equations are done. So if you want, not this week. I mean, this week is like already been crazy. But next week, sometime on maybe Saturday or something, I can take a class to kind of talk about that if you wish. I mean, I don't want to tax you people with too many lectures. I mean, I'm also giving too many lectures, but
Yeah, sure.
so you think about it. We can try to figure out some suitable time. Hold on, next Saturday. I have to do something else also. Just hold on.
Whatever time is suitable for you, and anyone who wants to join, I think, can join.
Yeah.
On Saturdays, we only have a tutorial from 3. Other than that, I think all are.
I see. I see. So let's try to kind of fix a time. I have to attend somebody's thesis exam actually. So that date is not fixed, whether it is Saturday or Sunday. But let's assume that it is on Saturday, so that but it is supposed to be in the afternoon. So if there is nothing else clashing on Saturday morning, we can have a lecture at 11 o'clock. This thing. One lecture is not good enough. Let me tell you right in the beginning. But at least it will cover something.
Sir, please inform through mail, sir.
Okay, I'll send a mail. So I just have to check if there's nothing else, then we can kind of fix it at 11ish. Okay, if that works with all of you.
Yeah, I think that should be fine.
Okay, good. So let's kind of just concentrate on this equation right now. We are already running out of time, but nevertheless. So when I say that the equation is singular, that means you write down the equation in this form and look at the coefficients of various terms. Okay, so in particular, like for example, suppose you look at the first equation. Okay, now because it's a coupled equation, it's a little more tricky than the ordinary differential equation. The examples that we'll study, say next Saturday, would be simpler example compared to this coupled system. But nevertheless, let's look at this. Coefficient of df by dr is h bar c. Coefficient of f is 1 over r times h bar ck. Coefficient of g is this piece. Okay, I don't want to read it out, but whatever. Okay. Now, what one does basically is that it's just pure convention, but it's a suitable thing to do. And that is look at the highest derivative piece and make its coefficient 1 by dividing by appropriate factor. In this particular case, life is very easy because the coefficient is just a constant, you just divide. But you may in general have some function, some uh, function, say a small f of r could be sitting around there. Then you just divide by that function and write down the highest derivative piece with coefficient 1. Okay. Nothing very special about it actually, but it's easier for the singularity analysis. In this case, our life is much easier. We just set h bar times c equal to 1. Okay, and forget about this stuff. Okay. Now you look at the functions multiplying the unknowns. Unknowns are f's and g's, and the functions are k by r here because h bar c is 1, and this quantity with some constant plus z squared by r. So clearly, as you take r to 0, these quantities are going to diverge, right? So therefore, this differential equation has a singularity at r equals 0. Okay. So it's a kind of very easy thing to kind of check in this particular case. So r equals 0 singularity is kind of, easy. You look at the second equation, there also you'll see that like r equals 0 is a singularity. Okay. Now to see that r is equal to infinity is also a singularity, it would kind of, it won't be immediately obvious by looking at this. Okay. So what you do is you write down r is equal to 1 by rho. Okay. Now when r goes to infinity, rho would go to 0, right? But when you write down r is equal to 1 by rho, then dr is equal to minus 1 by rho squared d rho. So therefore, d by dr would be written as rho squared d by d rho. Okay. If you do that, then what happens is that there's a rho squared factor sitting around d by d rho. These r's will go and sit as numerator rho squared rows. But because there's a rho squared multiplying the first derivative term, you need to divide by that, right? Once you divide that, then you see that e minus mc squared will have 1 over rho squared sitting around here. Jd squared will have 1 over rho sitting around there because this will go put a rho in the numerator, but you are dividing by rho squared. Similarly, this will have 1 over rho sitting around there. Now you take rho going to 0 limit and you find that this term as well as this term are singular. Okay, so therefore you find that r equals 0 as well as r equals infinity are singular points. Okay, fine. Now we of course want to do a more refined study of this stuff, that the singularity at r equals 0 is different from the singularity at r equals infinity. Okay, so so we will try do that maybe in the next class. Would that be okay?
So one thing,
Yes.
when we say singular, do you mean the equations are singular or the functions f and g will come out to be singular at r equals 0 and infinity?
No, the functions are singular. The functions multiplying the unknowns are singular. Okay. As a result, the solutions, namely f and g in this particular case, would have a peculiar behavior at those points. Okay. And we want to figure out what is that behavior. Okay. So it is this singularities of this differential equation tell you how to look for a solution really. Okay.
It is basically like what we kind of do in solving Schrodinger equation for hydrogen atoms. Like we
Yes.
see how when r goes to 0, how the solution should
Exactly. That's what we will do. So you have done that in Schrodinger equation thing, but like, the way it is done in quantum mechanics, it doesn't tell you as to what you are doing in differential equations. In quantum mechanics, you try to solve these equations. For example, even if you are trying to solve harmonic oscillator problem, you solve the harmonic oscillator problem at origin, at infinity, and then you try to kind of make some argument and show that these are the correct wave functions. Okay, that is the kind of argument we will give here also. But unlike the hydrogen atom problem, in the one-dimensional harmonic oscillator, you don't have a singularity at x equals 0 at all. Your differential equation is perfectly well behaved at x equals 0. Every coefficient is finite. Okay. Nevertheless, you try to solve your differential equation near x equals 0. which you can of course do that. And you should be able to solve differential equation at any point, including ordinary points, not necessarily only singular points. But the point is that, like, it is not even necessary to do that much work. You could have solved only around the singular point and obtained the entire result. Okay. But one actually ends up doing twice as much work in solving the harmonic oscillator, one-dimensional harmonic oscillator using differential equation method. Of course, half the time people convert that into A-dagger kind of operator method and say that, oh, it's quite trivial. Of course, it is trivial, this thing. But in the process, what happens is that, like, you do learn how to solve specific problems in quantum mechanics, but you do not learn the generalities of what the differential equation techniques are actually trying to teach you. Because tomorrow, if you find an equation which you cannot solve exactly, then you need to know this differential equation techniques, which will at least tell you how to proceed ahead. Okay, so in that sense, there is a utility of doing the singularity analysis and studying them. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, it might be getting this wrong, but if we substitute something like a polynomial Taylor expansion for FFT, we can make this entire equation behaving smoothly around r equals 0, right?
No, not necessarily. If r equals 0 is a singular point, then generically that's not correct.
Yeah. So in order to know whether r equals 0 is a singular point or not, we need to substitute and check, no?
Substitute what?
Some series form and then
No,
check
no,
whether.
no. That is the point. That we did not substitute f and g as anything so far. We still figured out that the equation has singularity at r equals 0, right?
I mean, it looks like it because it has a 1/r factor, but it might be that the functions themselves contain factors of r which might cancel out.
No, that is okay. See, I am not saying that the solution is singular. I am saying equation is singular. We are
Yeah,
talking.
that's what I was asking earlier, that we don't yet know whether f and g will have singularity at r equals 0.
Yeah. So f and g may or may not have singularity at r equals 0, but like or at r equals infinity. Point is not that. Point is that, like, we want to ask how would f and g behave in the neighborhood of singularity. Okay, that is our interest really.
Yeah.
Okay. So for that, we have to at least first recognize that the equation has a singularity. Okay. Once we recognize that, then the entire exercise in differential equation is to determine the behavior of the solution in the neighborhood of singular points. Okay. And the great fun of solving these equations is that, like, there exists two types of singular points actually. One kind of singular points are called regular singular points, and the other kind of singular points are called irregular singular points. Okay. And irregular singular points are defined in a kind of, in a very weird way, in the sense that, like, any singular point which is not regular is irregular. Okay, so that's the definition of irregular singular point. So you can easily imagine how complicated a irregular singularity could be in principle, because as long as it's not regular, it is irregular. Okay, so the point is that the properties are like this: that a solution that you obtain in the neighborhood of a regular singular point has a radius of convergence which is at least as big as the distance to the nearest singularity. Okay. So for example, if r is equal to 0 is a regular singularity, suppose in this case, then the solution that you obtain in the neighborhood of r equals 0 is valid all the way up to infinity, because the nearest singularity is at infinity. Okay. But if r is equal to 0 is, say, irregular singular point, then the radius of convergence of the solution is 0. Okay, so therefore the solution that you obtain in the neighborhood of r equals 0 as an irregular singular point, okay, cannot really be extended in, I mean, on any finite neighborhood. Okay, but remember, this is a statement about radius of convergence. It's a kind of, very specific point called radius of convergence. Solution would be extremely well behaved in some direction, but because it is a radius of convergence statement, that means you pick a point, treat all these quantities as complex variables, and draw a disk around it, radius, right? So you draw a circle around it and you ask, what is the size of the circle? Okay, and the answer is 0. But if you go in a particular direction, suppose you go in say along real axis or along imaginary axis of this complex variable, then the solution may be perfectly well behaved for quite some values. Even if r is equal to 0 or irregular singular point, it may be well behaved for r is equal to 200 also, okay, along one direction. But if you draw a circle, then it may be badly behaved. Okay, we will learn that at some point. Okay.
No, also,
Yeah.
since you have sort of agreed to this, I don't want to overload you, but could you perhaps in future take some sort of a class on analytic continuation?
Oh.
Like if
Yeah.
we have the time, of course, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can do that at some point. So maybe a little later. No?
After mid-sem, it may be possible because
I think so. Yeah, that would help me also, because I'm already overwhelmed with this. But after mid-sem, at least one course will be off my schedule, and then I can probably try to do something.
Yeah. Thank you.
So, but that is like still about a month away. But yeah, I hope you can kind of hold on to it.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Okay, any other question?